For some American veterans, the M1 Carbine was the perfect little rifle. Light on the shoulder, quick to bring up, enough gun for the kind of war they actually fought. If you asked them what they would carry again, they would not hesitate. They would say, almost fondly, "My carbine." As one post-war writer and American rifleman put it, for many GIs, meeting the trim little M1 Carbine was almost love at first sight, especially if their shoulders still ached from carrying a 10-pound M1 rifle. But if you talk to other veterans, especially those who fought in Korea, you will hear something very different. For them, the same rifle felt too light, too weak, too sensitive to cold and to the realities of combat. They were convinced that the M1 Carbine failed to stop the enemy when it mattered most. One weapon, two completely different memories. How did that happen? And who is closer to the truth? The men who loved their little rifle, or the ones who never trusted it? Decades later, a well-known firearms instructor would still look back and call the carbine an astounding and absolute success. But that verdict does not erase the doubts of the men who felt let down by it. In this episode, we'll explore where the idea of a light carbine came from, how it was designed, what it actually did in battle, and why its reputation has stayed so divided for almost 80 years. Chapter 1. Why America Wanted a Light Rifle. In the late 1930s, the United States Army lived in a world with two main kinds of personal weapons. For frontline infantry, there was the full-power service rifle. At first, that meant the Springfield, and then, more and more, the semi-automatic M1 Garand, a long, heavy rifle chambered for the powerful .30-06 cartridge. For officers, drivers, signalers, and support troops, there was the other extreme, the handgun. Revolvers and automatic pistols, good at very short range, hard to use accurately under stress, and in practice limited to a few dozen yards. Between those two poles was a gap. Officers and sergeants, artillery and mortar crews, tank and truck drivers, engineers, radio operators, military police, all of them were close enough to the fighting to be shot at. A pistol gave them very little. A full-size rifle was too long and too heavy for their everyday work. By the early 1940s, planners in Washington were frank about the problem. If these men came under fire, they needed something better than a handgun, but lighter and handier than the Garand. That is where the idea of a light rifle came from, a weapon to fill that doctrinal gap. Not a replacement for the main infantry rifle, but a personal defense weapon for soldiers whose main job was something other than being a rifleman, yet who still had to be ready to fight. The requirements the Army wrote down were surprisingly specific. The new weapon should weigh around 5 pounds. It should be effective out to roughly 300 yards. It should fire a .30 caliber round. It should be simple enough for rapid training and reliable in the field. In plain language, something a driver, radio operator, or artilleryman could carry all day, shoot more accurately and farther than a pistol, and still handle under stress. In early 1941, the Ordnance Department opened a competition. The first prototypes did not impress the test boards. They were either too heavy, too complex, or did not offer enough of an advantage over a handgun. Then Winchester stepped in. In a matter of weeks, its design team pulled together a new prototype, gas-operated with a short-stroke piston, a rotating bolt, and a new lighter cartridge that would become known as .30 Carbine. The result was exactly what the Army had been asking for. Light enough for a driver or assistant gunner to live with, simple enough for almost any soldier to use, and powerful enough to give real fighting chances where a pistol fell short. In the autumn of 1941, the weapon was officially adopted as the M1 Carbine. By 1942, it was in mass production. By the end of the war, the United States had built well over 6 million carbines, an extraordinary number, even by the standards of that conflict. Chapter 2: How the M1 Carbine was built, and what it could really do. From the outside, the M1 Carbine looks modest. A simple wooden stock, a slim 18-inch barrel, a small box magazine, and basic iron sights. But inside, it was carefully engineered around one idea: to combine lightweight with dependable function. Its action used a gas system with a short-stroke piston. When the soldier pulled the trigger, powder gases drove the bullet down the barrel and through a small gas port into a cylinder under the barrel. A short piston took a quick hit from those gases, pushed the operating slide back, and the rotating bolt unlocked from the barrel. The empty case was extracted and ejected. The recoil spring then drove the bolt forward again, stripping a fresh round from the magazine and locking it into the chamber. As long as the trigger was pressed, the carbine repeated this cycle, each shot faster and easier than a turned bolt rifle. The biggest difference lay in the cartridge. Instead of the powerful .30-06 used in the Garand, the carbine fired the lighter .30 carbine round. A bullet of about 110 grains left the muzzle at around 2,000 feet per second. In energy, that was roughly 1/3 of a full-power rifle cartridge, but nearly 3 times that of the .45 ACP used in the M1911 pistol and the Thompson. In other words, it lived in the same neighborhood as a hot .357 Magnum revolver load, far stronger than a typical handgun, but clearly weaker than a service rifle. That was exactly the point, a deliberate middle ground between pistol and rifle. The carbine itself was noticeably smaller and lighter than the Garand. About 35.5 inches long, a little over 5 pounds empty. A soldier could carry it on a sling all day, every day, climb into a Jeep or truck, climb out of a tank, jump into a foxhole or a ditch, or even jump from an aircraft, without feeling, as some said of the Garand, like I was wearing an iron fence post. The standard magazine held 15 rounds, almost double the 8-round clip of the Garand. Changing magazines was quick, simple, and easy to teach even to men who had never been rifle enthusiasts. Over the course of the war, the M1 Carbine grew into a small family of variants. The basic M1 semi-automatic with a fixed wooden stock was by far the most common. The M1A1 added a side-folding metal stock and pistol grip for paratroopers. That version fit neatly into parachute harnesses and made it easier for airborne troops to come out of a landing ready to fight. Later came the M2, a selective fire version capable of full auto, and the rare M3, an M2 fitted with an early infrared night vision sight. Those later versions had their own stories, but at the heart of the carbine's legend is still the plain M1, a light semi-automatic rifle with a 15-round magazine and a very specific job. It was so handy and comfortable that many who had a choice picked it willingly. How well that choice worked in real fighting depended heavily on which war and which weather they found themselves in. Chapter 3: In Battle. From hedgerows to frozen hills. In the Second World War, the M1 Carbine quickly found its natural roles. It went to airborne units, to artillery and mortar crews, to tank and self-propelled gun crews, to officers and NCOs in the infantry, and to men in units we might now call special operations. On the night before the Normandy landings, paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division climbed into their aircraft with M1A1 carbines folded against their backs. The folding stock and lightweight made the carbine almost ideal for jumping out of a C-47. When they landed among the hedgerows of Normandy, most firefights happened at short ranges. 50, 100, maybe 150 yards. In that thick green maze of sunken lanes and living fences, the carbine did exactly what it had been designed to do. It pushed through brush easily, came to the shoulder quickly, and allowed several fast, reasonably accurate shots at an enemy who might appear suddenly from just beyond the next hedgerow. Officers and sergeants leading small groups through that confused landscape valued a weapon that let them carry maps, binoculars, radios, and still not feel as if a heavy rifle was dragging them backward. On the other side of the world, in the mountains and jungles of Burma, a long-range penetration unit that history remembers as Merrill's Marauders made a similar choice. Their mission was simple to describe and brutal to execute. Push deep behind Japanese lines, march hundreds of miles through hills and jungle, and strike at enemy supply lines and strong points. On such marches, every extra pound of weight cuts into muscle and willpower. For leaders, scouts, and radio men, the M1 Carbine was an obvious partner. It did not turn them into long-range riflemen, but it gave them fast, controllable fire at the short ranges where jungle fighting usually happened at all. Armored vehicle crews also came to appreciate the carbine. As long as a tank or half-track is intact, its real weapons are its gun and machine guns. But if the armor is pierced or the engine bay catches fire and the crew has to bail out, the last thing they want is to crawl away with empty hands or only a pistol. A light carbine, clipped to a sling or stowed near the hatch, gave them a better chance to fight their way clear and move toward friendly lines or cover. In the Second World War, soldiers more often spoke of the carbine with respect and even affection. It was light, handy, and it gave confidence to men who, before, had carried only a sidearm. But only a few years later, the same weapon would earn a very different reputation. On the cold, dark hills of Korea. In the winter of 1950, American units in northern Korea found themselves in bitter cold. Temperatures plunged far below freezing, 20, 30, even 40 degrees Fahrenheit below zero in some reports. Men wore multiple layers of padded clothing, fur-lined caps, and heavy boots. Ice formed on rifle slings and on the edges of helmets, and sweeping down against them came large Chinese forces. In those conditions, the carbine, designed for Europe and the Pacific, was pushed far outside its original comfort zone. Around the Chosin Reservoir, weak points began to show. Lubricants thickened into sludge, bolt groups slowed, and a weapon that needed to be kept fairly clean now had to operate in blowing snow and freezing wind. Powder charges burned less efficiently in extreme cold. Muzzle velocity dropped. At the far edge of its effective range, the .30 carbine bullet lost both speed and stability. Magazines could crack if handled roughly. Chinese troops wore several layers of winter clothing which could soak up some of that reduced energy, especially at distance. American soldiers who fired into charging waves of attackers sometimes saw a man hit, stagger, and keep moving for a few steps before he fell. In the chaos of battle, moments like that etch themselves much deeper into memory than any ballistics chart. That is how the powerful image grew that the carbine won't stop them. It won't punch through winter coats. It's not reliable in a real war. Decades later, when historians and shooters began to test these stories carefully, the picture turned out to be more complicated. Controlled tests with original uniforms showed that at normal combat distances, the .30 carbine round could penetrate all the layers of clothing. Many of the worst reliability problems were linked to maintenance, lubricants that were too thick for the temperature, ammunition that had been stored badly, and magazines that had simply worn out. There was also a problem of expectations. A weapon designed as a defensive carbine for support troops ended up in the hands of men who needed it to behave like a full-power rifle. When it did not, resentment was inevitable. But in the minds of those who survived Chosin and other winter battles, what stayed with them was that terrifying moment when they believed their weapon had let them down. And that, too, is part of the truth. Chapter 4. What the Little Rifle Left Behind. After Korea, the M1 Carbine remained in service for many years. It served in American units among allies and in police and gendarmerie forces around the world. Eventually, it was replaced by the M14 and then the M16, but for an entire generation, this light rifle became a symbol of service, of youth, and of hard work that did not always happen on the very front line. When surplus carbines entered the civilian market, hundreds of thousands found new homes. For some buyers, it was an affordable little rifle for short-range hunting in the woods. For others, a comfortable range gun with almost no recoil, something you could use to introduce children or grandchildren to shooting. For collectors, an original wartime M1 Carbine became a piece of history you could hold in your hands. Paratrooper versions with folding stocks became especially prized. They now sell for high prices as icons of a very specific moment in time. On modern shooting forums, arguments about the carbine are almost as lively as those among veterans decades ago. Some shooters say they were surprised by its accuracy at 50 and 100 yards and by how gentle the recoil feels. Others point out that this is not a rifle for large game or long-distance work, that its proper place is still the middle ground between pistol and full-size rifle. A few go further and argue that the M1 Carbine should not be judged as a not quite Garand at all, but as an early ancestor of what we now call a personal defense weapon, a firearm for people whose main job is not fighting, but who must still be ready to defend themselves and their unit. Seen that way, many of the old disputes lose some of their heat. In the end, the M1 Carbine was never meant to replace the Garand. It was meant to give a signaler, an artilleryman, a driver, a paratrooper something better than a handgun, without loading them down with the weight and recoil of a full-power rifle. In that role, it did what it was asked to do. But the people who held it were very different from one another, and the wars it served in were very different too. That is why, even now, we still hear both grateful and bitter stories about the same little gun. Perhaps the honest way to talk about this carbine is to accept both sides, to admit that as a piece of engineering, it was well designed for its intended job, and at the same time, to remember that no rifle, no cartridge, ever removes from us the human responsibility for the wars we choose to fight with it. Thank you for listening.